Welcome. My name is Stephan Wiedner. I'm the CEO of Noomii.com. And as part of our series on toxic leadership, I have with me a very special guest. I'm excited to have her here today. Her name is Dr. Laura Crawshaw. She's the author of this book, Taming the Abrasive Leader. And you may have heard I use the word toxic leader. Dr. Laura Crawshaw here uses the term abrasive. So why don't we start there before we jump into the other content that I'd love to discuss with you. Why do you use the term abrasive in your work?
Right. I use the term abrasive because many years ago, when I started encountering abrasive leaders, these are the individuals that I primarily work with. I noticed that their behaviors rubbed people the wrong way. They grated on them, and thus the term friction. Then as years went on, I started hearing more about bullies and bullying. And I have never liked the term bully because it implies that these behaviors, these harmful behaviors are intentional. And in my many years of research with abrasive leaders, contrary to the belief that they all wake up in the morning, gleefully contemplating how to torment their coworkers, it's not the case. In fact, what I discovered is most of them are not aware that they are doing harm. And when you point out to them that they are, causing distress, they don't see it. So my thought is, I think we can all be abrasive. That's another point as well. It's not a pathological condition. We can all rub people the wrong way at times, but these individuals do it chronically. Finally, I'm not deeply opposed to toxic, but toxic implies some kind of external poison that they may have ingested and spread about. So just from the scientific standpoint, it seems a little less accurate and perhaps a little less treatable than saying that it's abrasive behavior, also known as unacceptable conduct. Those terms I use interchangeably.
And I think one of the distinctions I've learned from you is you do make that distinction between conduct and performance. Can you explain the difference?
Yes, absolutely. I think managers, as I, talk about people, leaders, managers, they're generally very comfortable with managing performance, which I define as the technical performance. So, if somebody's not getting enough widgets manufactured or getting the reports in on time or some technical aspect, the software written, management feels comfortable coming in and managing that and saying, well, what's going on? Why not? What needs to happen to have that occur? But on the whole, they've never been trained to deal with conduct. And when you're in the workplace, it consists of your technical performance, but also your conduct, your interpersonal conduct. In other words, how you relate to coworkers, customers, if you're a professor, students, if you're in a hospital, patients, etc. So this concept that you have to manage as a manager, not only performance, but also conduct, is somewhat alien to many managers. They're sort of surprised that it's their job to manage unacceptable conduct.
Yeah, I think often those two things get merged into one, right? So if
Yes,
performance is high, then conduct, it's
ignore
okay.
it.
You
Yeah,
ignore
it's
it. It's
okay. Yeah,
fine,
no big deal.
right?
Right, right.
So I've talked to a number of other guests already,
Hmm.
and what I wanted to really focus on with you, because we've had a lot of conversations around the abrasive or toxic leader,
Hmm.
and of course their victims, if we can use that word.
Hmm.
I want to talk about some of the other people that are around the dynamics and observing it, either bystanders, other coworkers, et cetera, maybe even the supervisor. So I'd love to see and hear what you have to say about the not just the direct or immediate victims, but the
Hmm.
people, the bystanders. What's going on for them?
That's a great question. First, when we define bystanders, I think you've done it well by saying anybody who observes the unacceptable behavior, the abrasive behavior. So it could be superiors, it could be customers, it could be a coworker at the same level. That's a good definition. Also, what I discovered in my years sort of bringing forward the coaching abrasive leaders into research is so many articles are written as if there was just one target. You know, they talk about the bully and the target, and then all the other bystanders. And in having coached over 450 leaders now at this point, I've interviewed an average of, you know, about, I don't know, 9 or 10 coworkers with each case. So that means I've talked to over 4,000 coworkers who have, on the whole, observed this behavior. So, what's with these bystanders, you know, and what should they do? Well, what happens is they observe this abrasive behavior, thus the term bystander. And what this behavior can do is instill fear in the bystanders. So I could be treated that way, number one. Maybe if I don't do something the way the boss wants, I will become treated that way. Secondly, if I go report it, perhaps the boss will find out and will retaliate against me. So this concept that, oh, all the bystanders should just freely feel comfortable going in and informing the company that there's, you know, bad behavior going on, doesn't really hold up, because more often than not, when a bystander does go in and voice concerns, there it's often written off as, oh, it's just a personality conflict between boss and Robert, you know, nothing to worry about. Or the bystander could also be perceived as another whining employee who's complaining about Bob. And again, the confidentiality could be revealed if you know the boss finds out that I've gone in and expressed my concerns. So the risks of reporting are very high. And think about the rewards. Is that bystander going to be taken seriously? Is the organization going to say, look, we have somebody coming in really verifying, you know, what other people have said? And maybe they will and maybe they won't. But I was just working with a case where 32 bystanders told the organization that a person was behaving abrasively, a leader, and they have done nothing about it. And why don't they do things about it? Well, I can give you many reasons. They may say, well, no one's filed a formal complaint yet. We can't do anything until there's a formal complaint. Or maybe they just choose to ignore it. You know, there are different reasons that employers avoid dealing with abrasive leaders. And the primary one is that they're afraid. They're afraid of being harmed, being sued by the leader, or the organization disrupted, or of doing harm. Maybe they care about the leader, or they're desperate to keep the leader on because they're so important. So this idea that a bystander, you know, if they don't speak up, you know, they're complicit somehow, you know, they haven't, well, you know, if you're going to speak up, you would do so if you thought, hey, I'll speak up because it'll accomplish something. Or sure, you know, it'll really something will happen then, or I'll speak up if I can do it safely. And then when they go in and find out that really the only way to do it is a formal complaint where you are named, it's no surprise to me that individuals aren't going to speak up. And then I have one more comment about that. The fact that intervention hasn't occurred with the abrasive individual previously tends to convince employees that the employer just doesn't care, or worse, that they condone this behavior. Why would I go in and report something that's going on if it's been going on for years and they haven't done anything about it? So I have a lot of empathy for bystanders, and those are a lot of my discoveries about why bystanders don't uh, make the employer aware of the situation.
I was recently in a situation where I was a bystander.
Okay.
And interestingly, what it caused me to do was to immediately go to the quote unquote victim
Hmm.
and alleviate their stress, I guess. I
To be
went,
kind to them. You were
yeah,
kind to them.
exactly. I was trying
Hmm.
to sort of
Hmm.
buffer it, saying,
Hmm.
oh, I saw what happened, first of all. And I don't think it was just you feeling like this other person was being
Hmm.
aggressive to you. I thought so too.
Hmm.
I observed the behavior and I also thought it was potentially out of line. And I tried to alleviate it by saying, I don't think you should take it personally. And yet there's a part of me that if we were to fast forward that behavior, and by the way, there's a third person, and so another bystander who was
Okay.
also brought into it, also acting in the same way. Eventually, I could see it creating a bigger divide, right? There's sort of the perpetrator and then the victims all sort of supporting one another, but
Hmm.
not really taking the issue head on. And of course,
Hmm.
as a coach, as someone who's trained and knowledgeable about what's going on, really, uh, I think I could be a lot more proactive. And yet I wasn't, because there was also some fear and anxiety. I didn't want to be picked on. I don't want to be the
Right.
the victim. I don't want to be on the receiving end of it. So that brings me to the question of, if you're a bystander, you're observing behaviors such as we've been discussing here in an organization. What do you do? What should you be doing?
Okay. Um, well, I got asked that question a lot, and I actually wrote in my book that you highlighted earlier, I wrote a chapter of entitled "Risky Business." So what should bystanders do, and what can be effective? And remember, I've talked about the risk of being written off. Oh, it's just a personality complaint, or Bob's just difficult, or Mary's always been that way. She's just irritable, and she can under stress. The employer making excuses for the individual. So I'll tell you, what I've discovered, and this is not my invention. This is what I discovered from interviewing coworkers and bystanders. There are some things that can be done. Certainly, you could report it to your own supervisor, and say, look, I saw this happen. And perhaps your own supervisor will then bring it forward, granting anonymity to you so that you don't risk retaliation. Another is to report it to HR, but sometimes that just isn't effective, because HR may insist, well, we need to know your name and we need to know what happened. And often what happens is the whole issue comes down to, well, Stephan said that this happened, but when we went and talked to Bob, he said he never said that. And so it all sinks into the morass of hearsay. We don't have the facts. So sometimes when you take it forward, a number of people take it forward, it may go into an investigation. But the problem with investigations is they don't solve the abrasive behavior. They don't solve the problem. And we can talk more about that. Other people go to ombuds offices. There are ombuds if they have them. And ombuds are increasingly feeling empowered to collect this data and use upward feedback, in which, with your permission, they would take it upward, again, not naming you. I think the best way for organizations to keep a finger on the pulse of the conduct is, first of all, to have a confidential hotline where people can call in and report their concerns without having to name them. And there's companies will say, well, what if a lot of people call? They've just all got it out for Stephan, and well, then my question is, well, don't we need to look at why they all have it out for Stephan and why you have all these calls? Perhaps there's a basis for that. So this concept of safe reporting. And another really important instrument is the annual climate survey, where people are asked to give, in anonymous ways, give very specific information on any distress they have with any of the individuals of the organization. And so many times we will get referrals of abrasive leaders after those surveys have been conducted. So the reporting has to be safe and confidential. I mean, that's really, the core of it. So those are but I will tell you, when I interviewed the most effective approach for getting an organization to move out of complacency and do something is what I call the mass mutiny. And this is when a number of employees get together and literally march into the superiors, the person above the abrasive leaders, and say, this cannot go on anymore. And in my book, I talk about how to do that. There are other instances where groups will write an anonymous letter saying that, 17 of us have written this letter. And they even go to greater ends. If it's an international organization, they might say, unless we see someone dealing with this situation, we're going to publish the letter in the newspaper.
Wow.
So this is where the bystanders represent a threat to the organization, motivating them to move. So the mass mutiny, really, we can't tolerate this anymore. But it can't be with nooses and torches. It can't. It has to be, this person needs help. They're treating us badly. You need to refer them for some kind of coaching. It's not that we dislike but it's not working. And mass mutinies can be pretty effective, but again, very frightening.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I'm glad you say that, because bringing back to the very first question, which I asked you about
Hmm.
the term toxic versus abrasive,
Hmm.
and what I like about the term abrasive is that it doesn't imply a fixed nature to someone, right? You are either toxic or not toxic. That could seem a lot more binary. Whereas
Right.
like, I can be abrasive, you can be abrasive, we can all be abrasive at times, and yet
Uh-huh.
some people are more abrasive more
Right.
frequently, more regularly with more people. So
Right.
it's more of a spectrum. And so that's what I like about the term, is it implies that this person can be helped. So it's not just,
Yes.
this person's terrible, let's lynch them.
They're poisoned. It's the end. It's hopeless.
Right. It can be improved. The situation can be improved, and to come
Yes.
with a little bit of empathy. And so now we talked about bystanders. What about the supervisor?
Hmm.
You've also interviewed a lot of
Oh,
supervisors.
yes.
What's the impact that leadership has on them? Because I think they're a unique player in the dynamic here.
Absolutely. So you're asking what is the impact on the superior of the abrasive leader, or where? Okay, what I discovered, because as you know, with every single case, I was interacting with the leader, and I'd talk to them, and I'd say, "Well, how long has this behavior been going on?" And I'd hear 13 years. Oh yeah,
We've heard
and
the same. It's crazy.
yeah.
I think our record is 37 years.
There you go. You've got that. That's the record. It's been going on for 37 years. Of course, my next question is, why now? Why are you thinking you might want to intervene? That's the term we use, which means setting limits, saying this can't go on, and also consequences of if this unacceptable behavior does continue. So why are you thinking of doing something now, intervening? Well, what I found was, the popular belief is that all these superiors, all these employers, they're all evil and they don't care, and, they could care less about their employees. But what I found was they were all afraid. Yes, believe it or not, afraid. And what were they afraid of? They were either afraid of being harmed, which means, well, if we, do something about Bob, if we talk to Bob, he could quit and then our revenues will go down. Or if we talk to Bob, he could sue us, or Bob could attack me, or he could sabotage us, or he could turn other employees against, all these fears or anxieties of being harmed. And then there are also all the fears of doing harm, which is, Mary's been loyal. She's been here 32 years and she's never behaved badly with me. Or, Mary's going through a divorce, or Mary just has a lot of tough employees, or, Mary's devoted all of her time to this organization. So it's what paralyzes them is they're afraid. They're afraid of being harmed or doing harm. And so we as coaches, and in this role, intervention consultants, have to help them work through their anxieties and help them understand that not only are the victims or targets suffering, but bystanders are suffering, the organization's suffering, and they're suffering because they're being perceived as weak leaders or tacitly condoning the behavior. And ultimately, the organization is suffering. And this can be turned around. It doesn't have to keep on going this way. And one of their greatest fears, they're going to lose the employee, the abrasive employee. And what I will say to them is, I'll say, look, what if you don't do anything? What's the plan? They never really thought about that. And ultimately they say, well, I guess ultimately we'd have to get rid of her. And we don't want to do that. And I'll say, great, why don't you invest in her with some specialized coaching to help her gain insight into how her words and actions impact others and to turn this around. So there's work that needs to be done with employers because they're afraid. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because they're afraid.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, often the folks that are reaching out to us are the
Hmm.
HR managers
Yes, right.
because someone in the organization has said, okay, we need to seek a coach or intervene in some capacity, and then they hand it off to the HR manager. But the HR manager is not the supervisor of the,
Right.
they're not the direct supervisor. So what does the HR manager do? What's their role? How can they best deal with that situation?
Well, I think, as coaches, you and I spend a lot of time helping these HR people really confirming their understanding that they're not in a position to motivate the abrasive individual to change because they have no authority over that person. So the focus needs to be on the abrasive individual's superior. And with the HR person coming to the superior and saying, nothing's going to change unless you get involved. And the coach would like to talk to you about how your role in this. So, we join hands with many HR directors who see all of the distress and who themselves feel kind of hopeless and helpless. And if we can join hands to help the superior, the manager above, understand that their role is essential because the coaching will not work without management saying this cannot continue, because the coaching client won't take it seriously. So.
What we see is at times that superior saying, well, can't the coach deliver this news to the to the leader, to the abrasive leader?
Yeah, can't the coach fill them in on everything they're doing wrong? And again, this is reflective of their fear of having that conversation. Well, when I hear that, I'll say, first of all, my guess is, I'll pretend you're that supervisor for a moment. I'll say, look, my guess is that Bob is going to listen to you and not me, because who am I? I'm just a coach. I don't have any authority over Bob. He doesn't know me, and I'm not offended, but he doesn't care what I think. But my guess is that Bob cares very much about what you think because you manage him. You authorize his paycheck. He may want your respect, etc. And so, no, it's critical that you share with him your concerns because you're the only one who can do that. Now, I can help you have that, we can rehearse that conversation, but if you're not letting him know about your concerns, you're not managing his conduct. I know it's difficult, but it has to come from you. And trust me, in the olden days, we used to accept referrals from leaders who did not intervene with their abrasive employees, and the coaching doesn't work because the coaching client would arrive on my doorstep and they say, why am I here? And I would say, oh, because your boss says XYZ, XYZ. And then the client would say, he never said that. Or that's not true. And and then I become the adversary, not the help.
Yeah.
So no, no, no. It's part of managing conduct because, again, employers are comfortable managing performance. They'll sit down and say, you're not getting the reports in on a regular basis, but they won't sit down and say, look, there are multiple negative perceptions about your interactions with people. They feel you don't treat them respectfully. This can't continue. Got to turn it around. I want you here. I want to invest in you, but it cannot continue. Mm.
Well, what we will sometimes see is that superior will say, well, by golly, if they can't see that the writing's on the wall, they're more obtuse than I thought, kind of thing. And I think one of the very first things that you said characterizes abrasive leader is they're just not aware.
They're not aware. They generally, and it was quite an amazing discovery, they viewed their styles as their abrasive styles, their aggressive styles as necessary and even noble. It's like, hey, I'm getting the work done, I'm getting the production done. I feel great about how I'm managing. And meanwhile, they're not getting any feedback from their superiors that would negate that self-perception. So yeah, it's a big shock. And when the superiors say, well, you think he'd know, well, don't think that. Okay, let's just not assume nothing. Let's go through this. And isn't it the polite thing to do? Wouldn't it be respectful to let an employee know that you have concerns about their performance or their conduct? And these concerns could actually lead to their being transferred, demoted, not being promoted, or in the worst case, terminated. Wouldn't wouldn't you want to know if it was you? Isn't it the respectful thing to do to let them know where they stand?
I agree. And I think often an abrasive leader will be of that nature. They'll be direct.
Oh, oh yeah.
Not gonna mince words, right? So for them, having that be said to them is not mean or spiteful. It's fact. It's useful information.
Yeah, it can be quite shocking, but they listen, they hear it.
I appreciate that.
And that's what can mobilize all this motivation to go into the coaching to work on eliminating these negative perceptions about the client's interpersonal style.
So let's talk about the last individual that we haven't addressed yet, which is
Mhm,
the abrasive leader.
mhm.
And I want to talk specifically about when they go through or have completed coaching. What's
Yes,
the impact now on them? What's life like for them after coaching?
it is much improved.
Okay. Yeah.
And if I can, I'd like to talk about kind of the advantages, and let's start with them, but also the advantages for the coworkers. What we find is that these abrasive leaders, it's very consistent. They drive themselves. They want to be viewed as top performers, and if they're not viewed that way, they have tremendous anxiety, which causes them, they defend against that anxiety. Any organism that perceives a threat defends itself. And the threat of being perceived to be less than competent stirs all this anxiety, which goes into fight behavior, fight or flight. And the fight is the aggression. So what happens when in the coaching, we help them gain insight into their behavior using this concept that threat generates anxiety, generates defense, or whatever. They start developing insight, and they start developing insight into themselves and others. And it's very exciting for them. They'll come in and say, I realize now why I ripped into that employee in the last meeting. And I'll say, why? And they'll say, because that employee's failure to agree with the project put the project at risk. And I did it, I ripped into him. And then, we ask the classic question, well, how'd that work for you? And the client goes, not very well. I alienated him. So then the task for coaching client is, how can you address your coworker's resistance to achieve your objective without being perceived as abrasive? So what happens is two things happen. Their capacity for accurate empathy develops because they're able to more accurately read behaviors and interpret them as, oh, that's fight behavior, that's flight behavior, or now we're working through. And that's what they've learned from the coach. So first of all, they get excited and they have more insight and they find new avenues to achieve their objectives without this primitive aggression. The other strong realization that these leaders have is about 3/4 of the way through the coaching. And what we do is we go back and re-interview the people we originally interviewed, the coworkers, and bring them back the much improved feedback, which is very exciting for them to see as well. But if I had a nickel for every time a coaching client said toward the end of the coaching, you know what, I realize I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to be perfect. I can just do the best I can. And that anxious drive to be perfect and to prove to everybody that I've got every base covered, that eases in the presence of the coach who asks questions like, well, why do you have to be perfect? You know, what's this perfect deal? Where did that come from? Because I'm not perfect and I don't think you're ever going to achieve it. We can use a lot of humor, but so they get excited, they develop insight, they find ways to achieve their objectives by analyzing accurately the resistance to their objectives, and they don't forget it. They don't forget this. It really becomes ingrained. Now, if I can just go on for a moment, if I can talk about the impact on the organization, when this occurs, number one, employee suffering ends because they're not using their abrasive behaviors. The employees are heartened that the formerly abrasive leader cared enough to change. And when I do the pulse check, they'll say, he's not perfect, but it means so much to me that he doesn't do this. Or you can see, she's struggling in these moments, but she doesn't do that anymore. And what that tells employees is that they were listened to, that those interviews, that the leader paid close attention to the interviews conducted by the coach. The employees also feel very positive about the employer. They'll say things like, thank God the employer finally did something. Or that's it. They finally did something and got a coach in here. Now, the leader is also not only excited about this new capacity for insight, but they are grateful that the employer didn't just fire them, that the employer gave them a second chance and invested in them and expressed faith in them. So you'll see that coming out. They also, the advantages to the employer is the employer reduces the potential for litigation or attrition or unionization or whatever, and they retain the leader's technical expertise. They don't have to fire the person. They keep them happily. And so, but then not every abrasive leader can change. So let me just talk about that briefly. What if they can't change? I'd say we see about 82% that do turn it around, but for the remainder, well, the employee's suffering ends because the individual was terminated, and the employees regard the employer positively for intervening, and the employer reduces the potential for litigation. And finally, and I've said this to employers, that you know what, it's too bad he wasn't able to turn this around, but you have the peace of mind of knowing that you as an employer did everything in your power to remedy the situation. You intervened, you offered specialized help, you did what you could. You could do no more. And so that relieves a lot of guilt about, oh, maybe I should have been able to fix this person. No. It was their job.
Mm.
So those are my observations over the years.
So my observations are the same, and yet there's one more little piece that we've seen.
Let's hear it.
Maybe you've also seen this. So yes, they change their behavior. There's all this insight and awareness, but there's also this like running anxiety around, I don't want to be perceived that way again, right? Like I don't want to slip up again. And because now they recognize the impact that they have had on people around them. So do you also see that, this sort of
Yes. In psychoanalytic terms, that's called the observing ego. They've now developed this part of themselves that observes themselves, which wasn't there before. I just do my thing and I'm fine. I don't have to monitor myself. But that observing ego, that monitoring goes on forever. And yes, it is a little bit anxiety provoking, but I think you and I have those as well. I think you and I monitor, how am I interacting with this client, or how am I handling this conversation? And they didn't have that before and they need it. So, it's helpful.
It's helpful.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts, Dr. Crawshaw, before I let you go around this whole issue of
Sure.
Of leadership and bystanders, the people around the abrasive leader?
Yes. What I would say to employers is listen And listen early, because early intervention is the very best intervention. If instead of waiting for 32 years, if you can go to somebody who's new to your organization, and bystanders have reported distress, and sit down with that person and say, you've only been here 6 months, but you're rubbing some people the wrong way. There are negative perceptions about you. I want to bring them to your attention, and we can get you some help for those. So early intervention, number one. I think number two, making safe avenues for reporting abrasive behavior, say through the climate surveys or an employee hotline. I think those are two really key ways to improve the situation early.
Can't agree more. Let's
Good.
eliminate together. Let's all eliminate the harm that's being caused by
Yes.
leaders in the workplace. I think
Yes.
you and I both agree that it's obvious that we need to create safe work environments so people aren't stubbing their toe and having bricks fall on their head.
Right.
But we want to create environments, workplace environments where people feel like they can show up, speak up, and be themselves at work without any psychological or emotional harm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's the key. Work is hard enough, let's face it. But if you as a manager can create an environment of certainly physical safety, but psychological safety, where people are free to do their work in an environment of respect, your organization's going to be functioning at a very high level.
Yeah, and that's the ultimate benefit, right? So it's not
Mhm.
just a good thing to do. It's actually
Right.
help the
Yeah,
organization.
it's not just the kumbaya factor. No
Yeah.
way. It pays.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your
You're
time, all
welcome.
your wisdom and your work, this
Yeah.
dedicated work that you've done for 20 plus years. You
Yes.
shine some really bright lights on this situation, and I'm just indebted to you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, I look forward to doing further work and getting our message out. So thanks for this opportunity.